Hi, I'm going to talk about a great time, a great era, and this is Brooklyn in the 2010s. So, as I'm speaking, we are about to close with 2020. So, I thought this would be a good time to talk about this very unique time and unique place. So, why is it unique? Why is it worth mentioning, you may ask? Well, you probably have an idea if you're listening to this. So the reason is because so many great things happened in artistically uh, with the migration of people to this area during that decade, the development, all kinds of cuisine, music, art, uh, business. It was really a place to be at that time in that decade. So I was there during that time. So I'm going to talk about what I saw. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience there. I'm not really going to reach into any history books or other sources. I was right there in the thick of it, in especially North Brooklyn, but actually I was in every part of Brooklyn during that decade, so I can talk about really a lot of it from firsthand experience. But primarily, I'm going to focus on what happened in North Brooklyn, where I lived, particularly the neighborhoods of Williamsburg, Bushwick, and Greenpoint. All right, so let's do a little background on Brooklyn and how I got there. So I'll start very quickly and a background of what Brooklyn is for those of you that don't know. In New York City is divided into five boroughs. That's what the different parts of New York City are called. There is Manhattan, which is the most famous, most well known part of New York City. It's where Times Square is, it's where Wall Street is. It has probably the most famous locations in New York City. It's an island, okay? Then there is Queens, which is the largest borough, and I could do a whole podcast about that too, but we're not. Queens is a really amazing place. Really, all of New York City is. There's the Bronx, which is north of Manhattan, and that's actually a peninsula mostly, and that is also worth mentioning. And then there's Staten Island, which is actually where I grew up, where I was born, and I know a lot about it too. Not as much to cover in that, but it's its own place. And then finally, the last borough I'll mention is Brooklyn. It's not a particularly large borough. I'm probably the second largest, though, compared to Queens. But there's a lot of people there in that small area. And there's a lot of different neighborhoods with a lot of different people and a lot of different, all these neighborhoods have different character and so many great diverse things, diverse people, and it's really it always has been like that for the last at least 100 years, but especially in the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century, it has taken on a lot of these neighborhoods have taken on such unique character, and they change too from decade to decade, usually, sometimes very rapidly. So the 1980s, 1990s was overall not a great time for Brooklyn. It was kind of the end of the industrial era there because Brooklyn as a Manhattan is kind of the center of New York City commerce and business, and Brooklyn was more of a industrial, especially North Brooklyn, more of an industrial area, more working class in terms of the people who lived there. It had had a tough time in the 80s, 90s, from what I know. My father worked there during that time, and there was a lot of crime. The crack cocaine epidemic was going on. There was a lot of racial problems. There was the Crown Heights riots. There was uh, different. Yeah, the neighborhoods were more split up in terms of race, very segregated. A lot of problems with crime and urban decay, you might call it, graffiti, poverty, drugs. Um, just overall, it seemed to be declining in a lot of ways, and the industry was declining. And then things started to really revive in the 1990s. New York City overall became a lot safer, and in out of this bad time, in once it got a bit safer, as my understanding is, in the late 90s, early 2000s, people felt a little better about New York City overall. It began to become a more optimistic place, a place you could go and really have a great time. You could go out again. You could enjoy the nightlife without so much fear. And businesses felt more secure about opening up. It started in Manhattan in the 90s, and then it started to spread to Brooklyn, which is very close to Manhattan, and particularly North Brooklyn. So you had a lot of neighborhoods right around there, which were attracting particularly younger people, especially people who were adventurous, willing to take on what was still a dangerous place. This was happening in the neighborhoods around Brooklyn Heights, Dumbo, which is an acronym for Down Under Manhattan Bridge Overpass. It's, in other words, it's right near the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges. And most famously in Williamsburg, which is the neighborhood that is known for the Williamsburg Bridge, which connects Manhattan to Brooklyn. Okay, so it's close proximity to Manhattan, and it had different groups of people had lived there uh, in the last 100 years. By the time this was happening, it was primarily Hispanic in one side. There was the Hasidic Jewish community on another side. There was an Italian Williamsburg. So it was already a diverse place, and then you had this influx of people in the late 90s, early 2000s moving in. There was they were a lot of them were artistically minded or were artists themselves, and there were from what I understand, I wasn't there much at that time, but there was these music venues which were, I guess, semi-legal or illegal. Some of them became really well known. There was a big music scene in New York City at that time. So these were places to go. They were exciting places. There were bars opening up that were attracting a lot of people. There was kind of this very bohemian, um, almost very free spirited type of feeling at that time. There was just a feeling that you could go to Williamsburg and set up what you wanted to do. You could start a band, you could make art, you could go into some kind of trade or craft or some kind of combination of all of them. It just seemed limitless at that time. Again, I wasn't there then, but that's what I heard from people who had moved there at that time, who were a little older usually. So yeah, very free spirited time from what I understand. I think I first started going there around 2004. And you were I was spending most of my time, I was working in Manhattan a lot. And you started to hear about this. Word started to get out that New York City's revival was spreading to Brooklyn, and that there were these all these things going on there, that people were moving to places that they would not have stayed in before, and it was changing. And really, um, what you heard is that it was the artists that were changing it. The artists were the draw. They were what was interesting. They were what was making the place cool, was making the place a real destination. And I think I really became I did there's a big bike an annual bike tour in New York City called the Five Borough Bike Tour, and it started in well I first my first time I was in it was in 2005, and that's when I really saw for the first time what was going on in these neighborhoods. And I remember riding my bike through Greenpoint, through Williamsburg, and it was just so fascinating. And I had started to hear things about it, and so it was really the first time I started to see it for myself. And other times I've been there at night, but I was riding through it during the day, so it just had this amazing feeling. And you were seeing other young people. I was in my 20s at that time, and I was seeing other young people there, and there was just this feeling of freedom and opportunity. And you'd see things like the street art and all these artistic people walking around, and businesses opening up, and bars and restaurants. And people made fun of it too. They made fun of the so-called hipster. That was kind of like a term used to describe a lot of the people who were moving there. Often it was used in a derogatory fashion, that they were vain, they were dilettantes, they fake, that they wore these weird clothes. But you know what? It was attractive, and I think it was attractive to a lot of people. So yeah, I became really, I became hooked. I became fascinated by it. The few places I know, I started going to again. This was around the 2007, 2008, 2009, and yeah, I went to the place I knew the most was the Trash Bar. I had first been there probably about 2004, 2003, and so I knew of it, and there was a place I knew, and I returned to again and again in years later, and it was great, man. It was this a real dive. One thing they just had a lot of like old car seats, and the place just didn't look good. I mean, it was not a glamorous place at all, but they just, yeah, I mean, they called it the Trash Bar, and it lived up to its name in a lot of ways. Especially they had this thing where they served you free tater tots. Like this guy just had, I don't know, a toaster oven or a microwave, and he would just zap the tater tots, and the bartender would just give it to you for free. So I mean, it had just like it kind of looked like what you would think a trash bar, a place called the Trash Bar, would look like. And they had a stage in the back, they had a bar in the front, and they'd have shows there from local bands or bands that were traveling through the area. They would have a lot of punk rock shows there. There was kind of still a punk rock scene at Trash Bar, at some other venues in that area. Oh, by the way, Trash Bar was in Williamsburg, in like a Grand Street, I believe, by Roebling, those areas. And yeah, it was you there. I would see the people in the community. I would see the scene that was going on there. Like they would have a karaoke often late at night, and some of these kids like were just really really good. I mean, you would want to go there. At least I did, just to see some of these kids perform karaoke. They were Some of them were really amazing singers, or there was something they put into the performance that was unique and that made it memorable. It was so yeah. You were just feeling like people could just take liberty with things like this. And there were some other so from there I started to branch out into some of the other bars, the other clubs in that area. I remember the first time I saw like kind of like a nice restaurant in Williamsburg was a restaurant called C, which was a Thai restaurant. And I mean, it almost looked like a Manhattan restaurant. And at that time, I still felt like Brooklyn just didn't have things like that. It was unusual to see. That was around Bedford Avenue. So started branching out. And yeah, you know what, it's like, yeah, I mean, I saw what people were saying about the community of hipsters as dilettantes or whatever, or that they found them annoying. But I found a lot of people who in some ways were like that, but there were a lot of people just out there just to make their mark in the world. And how much can you hate on that? So yeah, eventually uh, I started dating somebody who was already living there, who was in this community. And so I started going there more and more. And this was about 2010 now. And there was a place called the Third Ward. And they had classes for all different kinds of things: cooking, crafts, computer programs. It had been like some kind of workshop, I guess, as late as the 90s, early 2000s, and it had been repurposed. I think originally the guys who bought it were just having parties there, like kind of raves or underground parties. And then eventually, yeah, because it had a wood and metal shop, they started inviting some of the local artists, craftspeople to have classes, and it just really grew. I mean, there must have been like thousands of people part of it. And I mean, I found out about it. And um, I just started going there, going to events there, and going to classes every now and then. And I'm like, well, I mean, I can be a part of this scene. I had always had an interest in woodworking and crafts, and I'm like, well, here's my entrance. I never knew how to get into it before, okay? So this place, this scene, this area, this that was going on in Brooklyn at that time was my entrance into things I never really thought seriously I'd be able to do, but it was going on there. Like, there were other people like me who were coming from other places, far, far away from New York City, and not knowing anybody, and doing these things, starting restaurants, starting their shops, getting into design, construction, um, TV and film production, just all kinds of things, well beyond just art. There was so much starting to go on. So yeah, there was Third Ward there, and then in Greenpoint, yeah, there was film studios going up, TV production, TV shows were going on. You'd see the streets blocked off for all different kinds of TV shows. Girls with Lena Dunham was filmed there, Blue Bloods with Tom Selleck. I mean, so many shows. Also, there was the Silver Cup Studios nearby in Long Island City, which is a part of Queens, but is the next neighborhood over. So so much going on. I was a part of what was going on at Third Ward, which was located in around the. It was called East Williamsburg or Bushwick. So I was there. I was meeting other people like myself who just, looking for opportunity, looking for something to do to build a career out of what was going on there. And for the first time, I met um, I met also. I want to say that there was still remnants, or the old neighborhood was still there in a lot of ways. So, for example, at Third Ward, there were woodworkers there who were in their 40s, 50s, and they had been in Brooklyn and Queens for decades. So I was meeting them, and they were teaching me about the trade. They were teaching me about that life because that was just not something I was a part of before. I didn't grow up in it. So all these doors were opening up at that time. This is again around 2010, and I think there were really a lot of people like myself who were in the same situation because I knew a lot of them. So that's the first part right there of Brooklyn at the beginning of the 2010s. And how I got there, how I related to what was going on. So, yeah, I'll see how this goes, and maybe I'll put up another video about it. Take care.